What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Resonance, a Plague Tale Legacy, which is an action-adventure set in, of course, the Plague Tale universe, you could call it, as it is a prequel to the two Plague Tale games. Now, an important thing to understand here, though, is that this game is giving us the backstory of one of the characters from those games, Sophia in particular. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I do need to inform you that I'm able to bring you this video on August 26th, just a day before the game officially releases, because of course I was given a review key for it from Focus Entertainment, the game's publisher. And on that front, there's a few other things I want to mention. For starters, spoilers. So this is the kind of game where I think even just hearing about it can certainly spoil some of the experience. Like, there's things I would like to explain in this video that I would say definitely qualify as a little bit of a spoiler. So I'm going to give a TLDR here in a moment that might be worth it for you if you don't want those spoilers, but just be aware of them, I suppose. Otherwise, as 100% go, this is a very straightforward and easy game to 100%, which from what I understand is also the case for the Plague Tale games. Basically, all you've really got to do is run through the story once, at which point you have access to a chapter select, which will let you hoover up the collectibles because it shows you what collectibles you are missing from what chapter, and that progress is saved outside of them. So just run through the story once, go back to the chapters and grab the things you missed, and because it shows you exactly what chapter you need to look at it for, it's, again, pretty straightforward, not a difficult game to 100%. And that's before we start talking difficulty options. But let's move on a little bit to the overview here. So as I mentioned, this is a prequel to the Plague Tale games. It gives us the backstory of one of the characters there, Sophia. But as a bit of a TLDR, as a total package, I just don't think I would recommend this game to anyone. It is ultimately $50 US for its asking price, and for reasons I hope this review provides enough detail for. But to keep it simple, I think the combat for the game they tried to make here doesn't really work. It's like this parry-focused combat thing, and while you can turn the difficulty down so far that you're just immune to damage, it's at that point kind of just not engaging with the full game, so I think the combat system doesn't work for what they were doing here, even if the gameplay for it is pretty smooth. So much so that I actually enjoyed the combat, I just don't think it fits. They also, as a bit of a narrative choice, decided to set Sophia's backstory as part of the myth about Theseus and the Minotaur, and the problem there is that I would say they made some pretty substantial changes to that story that didn't feel good to me at all. And outside of those things, which is already a problem because this is a game with a big focus on narrative, and the narrative didn't really deliver for me, you're left with gameplay that I would say is very run-of-the-mill these days, a lot of very standard action-adventure stuff, there's some repetitive light puzzles, and by the end of it, honestly, I just didn't really have a good time, and so for that reason, I don't feel good about recommending it, and so I'm not going to. But let's detail all of that out over the rest of this review. So starting with the technical state, how's this game running? I did have some problems, but I'm not entirely sure it was the game's fault per se. So when I first started playing this game, I downloaded it, jumped into it immediately, and I was crashing like maybe once an hour or so, which was annoying, yes. And that started getting a little worse until about the mid-game when it was crashing, I would say every couple of minutes. And at that point, I was like, clearly something's wrong. So I started troubleshooting, I verified the files, and it turns out that one of them was missing. So I tried to, of course, download that file and fix that, and then at that point the game wouldn't launch at all, so I just uninstalled it and reinstalled it, after which it crashed a couple of more times, and then finally just seems like it sorted itself out and it was smooth sailing afterwards. So I'm not sure if there was a problem with the initial download, because to be clear, like, this was all more or less the same day, I think within about 24 hours of each other. But because of the way that went down, I'm again not sure if there was a problem with the download, like something got messed up somewhere, or if it was just some other obscure issue. So I'm not ready to lay the blame for that at the feet of this game. But I am going to throw it out there just in case other people run into those issues, and truth be told, as the TLDR should have told you, even if I hadn't had these problems, I wouldn't recommend the game, so it's whatever, I guess. Moving on a little bit, let's talk difficulty and chapter select. So this game has a combat system some people aren't going to jive with, and that is because it is primarily a parry-based combat system, where you are parrying and dodging out of the way of enemy attacks in order to stun them, and then deal massive critical damage. As you would probably expect, given that this is not not, I would say, a really combat-oriented title, there are difficulty options for this. Everything from narrative, which makes you effectively immune to damage and unable to be killed, all the way to super hard mode, which makes it very easy to kill you, but even on normal you can only take a couple of hits. The catch being that you restore health whenever you kill an enemy, and there are tons of enemies. Our main character is honestly a bit of a serial killer by the end of this. She will have killed hundreds of people. While the game doesn't have a New Game Plus system per se, once you complete a chapter, you're able to go back and play through it again, and this is going to be how you hoover up collectibles and finish the game up. And I do appreciate that all the progress there is saved, so the game should respect your time for the most part at least, but that does bring us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So, the story starts off interesting enough, with it showing Sophia being very young and being more or less trapped in a convent, being used by nuns for some sort of experiment, causing her to see visions of this island that she is forced to draw. But apparently the nuns have been doing this and some kids have actually died from it, but we are ultimately rescued by Sophia's father. The visions, however, do not stop. She is constantly being called to some island and they find it. They know where it is, but ultimately Sophia's father dies there, but not before passing all the information on to his second in command, who continues to raise Sophia. And when she becomes an adult woman, things come to a bit of a head because the gang she's with has been trying to locate the treasure on this island for quite some time and has been sort of beating their head against a wall fruitlessly in order to do that. Now, part of that is that they go to steal a chest guarded nearby in a city by the local army, which naturally goes bad, but then forces us to the island in question, where we have to get to the bottom of what happened here to both solve Sophia's past with what happened to her dad, why she's been called to this island, etc. However, there's another sort of twist here where the island in question is actually the island of Crete, home of the legendary Minotaur and its labyrinth. And the story of the island itself largely kind of centers around that myth. And while I'm certainly okay with, I would say, any modern storytelling taking some liberties with that kind of thing, I do think they did a bit much in regards to it here. There are several very large changes to that story that kind of just make it a different story, to the point where I'm not entirely sure why they bothered using this myth as a basis for this story at all. I don't want to go into full spoiler territory here, but there is an audio cue towards one of the big changes, which was, I would say, kind of the nail in the coffin for me once it was officially revealed, though because of the audio cue, you do kind of see it coming from a ways away. Now, that's not to say it's all bad. I think there are some moments with Sophia and kind of seeing her grow up and interact with life the way that she has that I think provides decent answers to her character, but because of the way they've sort of velcroed it onto the story of Theseus and the Minotaur and then made such sweeping changes to it to make me question why they used it to begin with, left me overall just not really enjoying it that much. And as a narrative-focused game, even if they do have this sort of parry-based combat system we'll get into, the primary focus here is the narrative and that experience, and I just didn't really have a good time with it, which is, I would say, the biggest contributing factor to not recommending this one. But that does bring us to progression. As an action-adventure title, this game has relatively simple progression mechanics, coming down to your skills, charms, and your blades. So, as you move through the game, completing combat encounters or finding them on occasion, you'll be picking up resonance. Resonance are, in effect, skill points that you will spend on one of your 6 main skills, both unlocking them at first, which increases as you go, and then for a flat rate, accessing the binary choice of upgrade to that individual skill. So each skill has an either or upgrade that you can grab for some extra resonance, and some of those are pretty powerful, like the ability to parry the incoming normally unparryable attacks, like just letting you parry those, is a really big one. That one was a bit of a game changer, but there are others like absorbing damage or being able to redirect and throw enemies around that is extremely helpful as well. So some good stuff there. Another big part of progression are your charms. This is one of the main ones in the sense that you're going to find a bunch of different charms, 5 of each type, and these both actually add on to your appearance by adding those charms onto your person. They also increase an associated chance. So each charm in a set increases the chance for that ability. So like for instance, a certain type will give you extra critical damage when you crit, and that has a higher chance of proccing. Another one can keep you from dying when you normally would have, and the more charms you have in that set, the more chance there is of that happening, that kind of thing. And then lastly, there are blades. So You use a sword and a dagger in this game, and you can pick up different swords as you go. Each sword has a sort of special ability that will, of course, alter how it is used. There's a few different ones, 8 in total, not counting the sort of pre-order one, I think it was. So there's some ways to customize exactly what's going on there as well. But that brings us to the gameplay and world section. This game is divided up in between 14 different chapters that, as I mentioned, you can replay after you finish them. This ultimately means, however, the game is relatively linear. Some of these chapters are a little bigger and have more exploration involved, but even then, not that much. And as a result, I'd be surprised if this game took you more than like 15-20 hours at most, and you can certainly get through it in much less. Now, what you're actually going to be doing in those chapters is, of course, running around, fighting various enemies, solving puzzles, engaging in combat, finding the associated rewards, and in a couple of sections running from monsters who are all based on light and guiding it around. So we'll save combat for its own dedicated section, so let's talk about the rest of it. There is an element of platforming. You're going to be doing things like crawling through places, searching for alternative routes, zip-lining your way across the island, that kind of thing. So that's kind of what I mean by platforming. It is relatively easy to fall to your death, so you might want to be a little careful about where you are platforming, but otherwise, very sort of standard action-adventure stuff on that front. Now, often hidden in discrete areas are things like artifacts, which are just like little collectible bits with some backstory, as well as resonance points or the chests which contain your charms and whatnot. So that's kind of your reward for doing that exploration, including the blades. But oftentimes, in order to get those things, you'll also be solving puzzles. Now, these puzzles are fine, but they get a little repetitive over the course of the game because they're all more or less the same puzzle, which is mostly guiding light around various rooms. You see, all of your non-human enemies basically have a weakness to direct sunlight, and so unsurprisingly then, direct sunlight is pretty heavily involved in all of the puzzles here, and much of it revolves around standing in a specific spot, using the captured light from that spot to then redirect it elsewhere. This can be as simple as just holding up what is effectively a lantern that you can only use in certain places, which then illuminates some hidden puzzle piece, that kind of thing. And then other times, a little later into the game, you have a version of this that will split the light beam into 3 different colors, red, blue, and green, that you then have to orient in a certain way to hit 3 spots at the same time. And then a little later still, you get the ability to powerfully redirect your light, which can burn things away here and there. And outside of combat, those puzzles and that exploration is the vast majority of the gameplay outside of combat. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the monster section. So most of the time you're fighting humans, but there are sections where you have to fight this odd monster, let's say, that will chase you around and is focused on light, and then occasionally you'll run into some other sort of, I guess you could call them supernatural enemies towards the end of the game as well, but they're also relatively simple. Now, the big monster is really the one I want to talk about because it functions a little differently than the rest. Primarily around the blue trails you'll be leaving. So in certain areas of the game, walking around leaves a blue trail behind you. The monster is attracted to those trails, and when it breathes in, it pulls those blue trails in and then sort of goes hurtling towards wherever they are. You can get around this a little bit by crouching and going slowly because this won't leave those trails behind you. The catch is, you still have those spores on you that are causing the trail. So if the monster breathes in and you're not in cover, it will still discover you and go hurtling towards you. There are times you have to run from this thing, which is like an extended platforming section. You either have to get to light or do things to slow it down, like jumping across gaps where it loses the trail, or runs into things, etc. And that's about as exciting as the non-combat gameplay gets, which is why I said it was pretty run-of-the-mill. Which brings us then to the combat section. Combat, as mentioned, has a pretty big emphasis on parrying in particular. Now, thanks to the difficulty options, you can make yourself invulnerable if you want to and breeze through it without parrying, but the primary system is centered around that parry system. Luckily, parries are not particularly complicated, even if the timing can be difficult, as your main goal is to parry incoming blows at precisely the right time. The catch being, regular blows you can block, so if you miss the parry timing, you'll probably still block because it's the same button and you'll be okay. Yellow attacks have to be perfectly parried, otherwise they will cut through your block and hit you anyway, and red attacks, barring a single skill, cannot be blocked or parried and you have to dodge out of the way. And so dealing with a lot of enemies, throwing those attacks with you at once is the challenge there. Now, to take that a little bit farther, we have very little health. On normal, you've got just 3 health, and The way you restore that is by killing enemies, which will restore one of the points of health. So you can absorb a hit or two, which is fine for most clusters of enemies because you have various ways to stun them, like throwing just various things you find around the battlefield at them to stun them, which is when you can perform your critical strikes. Critical strikes are basically a charge attack on a defenseless enemy that deals a lot more notches of their health and will often kill them outright. And then there are some mechanics and things that will trigger off of killing enemies in this manner, but we got a few more things to mix this up a little bit. So we also get a hold of a grappling hook. This is important for pulling archers and stuff down from their vantage points, in addition to kicking them off of ledges, which works well for everyone but the heavy enemies who don't really respond to that very well. There are also enemies with shields and the like you'll have to burst through. There's also a brute type enemy who is of course big and just throwing the red unparryable attacks everywhere, but you can lure that guy into killing his teammates. And then on top of that, you've got the focus attack. So a little ways into the story, you will be able to start building up a charge as you engage in combat, and when it's full, you can do a big sweeping AoE with it, which can change a little bit depending on your weapon sometimes, but a big AoE that hits multiple enemies around you and kind of gives you some space to work with as you focus on those parry systems. And so a lot of combat is trying to balance all of those things at once, and while I think if you've played a lot of games where parrying is a significant mechanic, you'll be totally fine here. It's really not that bad. I also know that a lot of people really don't like this particular type of combat, but having played a few of them myself, I will say that the combat is okay for what it is. I will, however, also throw out a counterpoint to that, being that I just don't think it fit the type of game this is trying to be, like this narrative action-adventure puzzler thing, to then have this relatively unforgiving, even on normal parry-based combat system, feels very at odds with each other, which is another thing I didn't really like about it. And yes, they give you that invulnerability option, but then at that point it feels like you're not really engaging with the game in full anyway, which leads into its own problems. It just doesn't feel like a cohesive thing to me. And then there's the number of enemies you're fighting. There are fights where you're absolutely going to be fighting like 20 plus enemies and killing all of them, and it just gets to be a little bit silly, to be honest. But the main thing I guess I want to stress here at the end of the combat section is that the combat itself is good. I just don't think the system they've built makes any sense for the rest of the game, is really kind of the main thing. The combat itself, totally fine. If you enjoy this type of combat, I think it is enjoyable. It's a relatively smooth experience, and they did some fun things with it. But that brings us to the Steam Deck and the Steam Machine as we start wrapping this thing up, and that is going to be a very short one because I could not get this game to start on either of them. It would crash immediately upon starting. I tried a couple different versions of Proton and could not get them to work at all, so it's possible someone will figure out a solution after this releases in full, I would imagine. But as for the sake of this review, I could not get them to start, and thus I can't really say, outside of, they wouldn't start. But that brings us to positives, negatives, and then we'll start wrapping this thing up. On the positive side of things, I've basically got one big positive for this, and that is that the gameplay itself, and combat in particular, is a smooth experience, and I think if it were the focus of this game, it would be enjoyable, but it clearly isn't the big focus, and it distracts from the thing they're trying to do, but the thing they're trying to do also isn't that great, which brings me to my negatives. I don't like a lot of what they did with the story here, how they changed up the myth about Theseus and the Minotaur. Like I said, they just wound up changing it so much that I have to question why they bothered using it at all. Most of the gameplay is pretty run-of-the-mill action-adventure stuff. I think the chase sequences weren't very fun. I also think that the puzzles in particular, the light puzzles, got very repetitive by the end of it. There's just a lot of them. I didn't mention this anywhere else, but just to throw it out there somewhere. For whatever reason, the download size for this game is like 80 gigs, and for such a short game just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. That's something they could stand to tamp down a little bit. But when you start putting all of that together for a conclusion, I would say Resonance of Plague Tale Legacy is just not a game that I enjoyed very much. It is certainly not the worst game I've ever played or anything, but so much of it just seems at odds with itself, and so ultimately the game just wasn't for me, especially for $50 in the face of all the other releases that are about to happen over the next couple of months. But as for today and this particular game, that's pretty much all I've got to say on it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, especially if you wind up playing it for yourself. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.